What's up, gamers? Welcome to another Magic the Gathering Cube video brought to you by yours truly. I am Ryan Overturf, and these are my picks for the most cubable cards from Duskmourn House of Horror. Let's dig in. Before I get to my list of most cubable cards from Duskmourn, let's do a little refresher here on what I mean by most cubable. It's of course a subjective thing. It's going to mean different things to different players, different cube designers. This is not meant to be a gospel on cube or anything outrageous like that. These are just cards that I find appealing, and I'm just trying to rank them because people like numbers and metrics. My general focus is on traditional singleton 1v1 gameplay with 40 card decks. That's kind of the shape that most cubes and games within cube take. I'm considering this in a broad sense, what's going to be appropriate for the most cubes, maybe most impactful where they're played, maybe most novel, maybe things that build on existing infrastructure in the most interesting ways. And this is not just a list of the most powerful cards from the set. I don't think that that generally makes the best cube play. Of course, for something like Vintage Cube, I'm often looking for just the most powerful cards. But those sorts of things really tend to work themselves out over time. So these are just cards that I find the most fun and potentially appealing. Before we get to my list, I would also like to talk about some keywords, abilities, and themes from Duskmourn. The first of which is Manifest Dread, which is a new take on Manifest. To Manifest Dread, you look at the top two cards of your library, put one onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature, and the other into your graveyard. And then if that face down creature is a creature card on its front side, you can turn it face up for its mana cost whenever you have priority. This is a riff on the ability Manifest, of course, which is originally a riff on the ability Morph. We saw another take on face down 2/2 creatures earlier this year in Murders at Karlov Manor. I kind of hated Disguise as an ability that appeared on a creature, but I did like Cloak, granting abilities to cards that you don't really know what's going to be on the other side. I think that that is pretty fun, even with the Ward 2 stuff. So this is closer to that, and that's what I liked from Murders at Karlov Manor. This is fun gameplay, I find, both in giving the caster some agency. You choose one card or the other to manifest. Putting cards into the graveyard from your library also is very fun for me. It's a big theme in my Spooky Cube. And you give your opponent some information too. Seeing the card that your opponent chooses to put to the graveyard gives you some information and helps you to maybe sniff out what's going on in the game, and that can be a fun mystery to solve. An ability word appearing in Duskmourn is Survival. We see this on creature cards. It's an ability word that says, basically, if this creature is tapped in your post-combat main phase, you get some kind of bonus. This largely appears in green and white creatures. I have Cynical Loner here as the lone black card with this ability that gives you kind of a free entomb if it's tapped. I have all three of these cards in my Spooky Cube. Cynical Loner, Veteran Survivor, Reluctant Role Model. They're all humans. They play to synergies in that way. They make the game about combat and kind of being tricky there. I have found that this is a really fun ability to pair with Convoke. If you can tap these creatures to pay some kind of cost, that opens up some really cool things you can do in gameplay. I actually just added Stoke the Flames to the cube for the first time, and that's just a really cool card, so I was happy to do that. I have found that the ability is pretty boring with vehicles. If you just tap one of these creatures to crew a vehicle, that's just not really an exciting cost. The vehicle is either good or it's not, and then this is just more upside on something that's already good. Whereas Convoke gives you a little bit more to think about in terms of lining up attackers and blockers. I did try Smuggler's Copter in the cube to further push this ability for one draft, and I had a bunch of survival creatures. My opponent drafted Smuggler's Copter. They beat me up with it. It wasn't really that appealing or fun. Delirium is also returning in Duskmourn. This is, of course, the ability word that checks to see if you have 4 or more card types in your graveyard and then gives you some kind of bonus if you do. Fear of Missing Out, Wildfire Wickerfolk, and Patchwork Beastie are 3 awesome new cards with Delirium that also have made their way into my Spooky Cube. I particularly like that they have 2 card types. They have Delirium payoffs, but just by existing in your Delirium deck, which probably has some kind of self-mill, some kind of discard outlets, Fear of Missing Out, also being a discard outlet, which is super nice. Just being able to put these cards into your graveyard will help you attain Delirium, And then if you have Delirium, these cards all get better. So this is really awesome stuff to see to add to an environment that cares about Delirium. Big fan of this return. The Delirium cards in Duskmourn, they are all contained within red, black, and green, so it's all Jund stuff, which is fair. That's where you tend to see a lot of Delirium anyway. I would like to see more support in blue and white in the future, but beggars can't be choosers. There's some really nice stuff here. In addition to being a big graveyard set, the other major theme in Duskmourn is Enchantment Matter, which is referenced on the Eerie ability word, which says whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, you get some kind of boon. So here's Entity Tracker, the blue Verduran Enchantress, as it were. The first time we've seen a blue Enchantress kind of effect, which is kind of neat. I would also like to call attention to Valgavoth's Lair, the first enchantment land, which is a very cool way to trigger abilities that care about enchantments, or to add a free enchantment to anything that cares about the number of enchantments you have on the battlefield. Having Hexproof makes it immune to disenchant effects, which is really nice. Being able to fix for any color is a nice benefit as well. It's not the strongest card, but the idea is that you put it in a cube where enchantments really matter, and then it can really shine. I think that's a really great card to sneak into the set here. And then there's the new enchantment type Rooms. Rooms are split cards that show off two different enchantments. You can cast them for their left side or their right side. When you cast them, they enter at whichever room you paid the cost for. So then you either have some kind of enters ability on that room or just a static ability for controlling it. And then the other side shows up as a closed room. You can then pay the mana cost of that side, and then you get that ability of it unlocking or just the static ability of controlling it. And once you unlock the other door, you have both rooms. Kind of a good rules thing to know. If you blink a room, they come back with only one door unlocked. You can't just exile and return these rooms and have both of them suddenly open. So you can't really cheat in big ways with them. You're mostly casting one side or the other, presumably with the intention at some point to control both halves. I was a little bit wary of rooms as a new mechanic just because it's another spot with a lot of text on a card, but I have found rooms to play generally pretty intuitively, and I have enjoyed playing with quite a number of them in my cubes already. And finally, the last thing before we get to my list, we have a new land cycle in Duskmourn, the Verges. It's not a complete cycle. There's only 5 of them. We have allied colored Verges. These are lands that tap for one color, and then they tap for a second color of mana if you control the appropriate basic land for either of those colors. So Blazewire Verge, it taps for black, but then if you control a swamp or a mountain, it taps for red. This is a cycle that we'll presumably be seeing enemy entrance for in Standard sometime soon, and in theory, this could be a full 20 card cycle. You could have some Verge that taps for red, and then also taps for black if you control a swamp or a mountain. You know, maybe on like a 5-year, 10-year timeline, we could have a full 20 Verges. What I like about these cards for Cube is that you can really design around them. If you have a card like Hushwood Verge, that tells you, okay, the green-white deck is based in green. I want Llanowar Elves more than I want Savannah Lions if I'm trying to play green-white. If you're not doing that kind of thing, where your cube's color considerations are based around these Verges, they're a little weird to show up, especially because it is an incomplete cycle. We have more incomplete allied cycles at this time than enemy cycles. For incomplete enemy cycles, it's really just Horizon lands. So generally, I don't like these cards in Cube that much right now, unless, again, you specifically have that kind of fun color consideration going on to kind of nudge players in that way. And I also try not to put lands and land cycles on my top 10 list just because they're a little bit more fundamental. I always want to talk about them, even if I were to come up with 10 better cards or 10 more cubable cards from a set, I would always want to talk about the lands, so they kind of have a place of honor here before my top 10, even if they were some of the best things, which I will repeat that until this cycle is completed, the Verges would not have made my top 10 list for Duskmourn. Without further ado, let's get to the list. At number 10, I have Roaring Furnace / Steaming Sauna. This is one of those room cards. One half is Roaring Furnace for 1 and a red. When you unlock this door, this room deals damage equal to the number of cards in your hand to target creature and opponent controls. And Steaming Sauna for 3 blue. You have no maximum hand size, and at the beginning of your end step, draw a card. Roar of Furnace is a decent removal spell. It's one of those red removal spells that early on can take care of a high toughness creature, and is reminiscent of the card Fires of Victory from Dominaria United, which was a pretty nice removal spell in that limited format and did see some standard play. So this is a card that's just reasonable to play as a removal spell. And while Steaming Sauna is an inefficient sort of card advantage, it is still a source of card advantage. So if you kill something with the Roaring Furnace, then the Steaming Sauna just gets to pay you off later. And if you don't kill something with Roaring Furnace, well, you tried. You had a decent removal spell in your deck, and then you just get to play this card advantage engine. So you should get something nice out of this room card. And the sum of the parts here definitely make for an appealing card. It always does something. Even if you wouldn't just play Steaming Sauna, you'll probably get a target for the Roaring Furnace at some point, and you can just board it out if it doesn't seem to be the situation. And this is just a reasonable card to main deck in a blue-red control deck, and I would play it in like an aggressive deck, maybe a prowess kind of shell, that would want the Roaring Furnace to take care of a blocker and then can take advantage of the Steaming Sauna if the game goes long. At number 9, I have Floodpit's Drowner. Floodpit's Drowner is a 2/1 merfolk for 1 and a blue with flash and vigilance. When Floodpit's Drowner enters, tap target creature and opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. And then for 1 and a blue and tapping, you can shuffle Floodpit's Drowner and target creature with a stun counter on it into their owner's libraries. So Flash plus Vigilance makes for a real nuisance in combat. You flash this in whether you tap something or not, and then you have this decent attacker, decent blocker, threatens to trade with anything with 2 toughness, can pressure planeswalkers. It's a lot to like for only 2 mana there. And it can trade with creatures large or small, or just be a nice tempo swing with that stun counter. It's a chunk of mana to actually use that shuffle ability, but in a pinch, it'll come up and you can win games that might be difficult otherwise for blue decks that can't always deal with large creatures on the battlefield. It's a little irritating to read Floodpit's Drowner. There's a lot of text on the card. To really intuit what's going on, it's going to take some amount of time playing games with the Drowner. It's going to take a couple reads and rereads, but it is seeing a good amount of standard play, and I would believe other constructed formats as well, and that definitely helps cushion that sort of thing. The more this card shows up in other places, the less you have to give it specific care when you consider including it in a cube. At number 8 is Tyar The Pummeler. Tyar The Pummeler is a legendary elf warrior. It's a 3/3 for 1 green. You may tap another untapped creature you control to give Tyar indestructible until end of turn, and that would tap Tyar. And then for 3 green, creatures you control get +X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. As a 3 mana 3/3, this is just a card that makes sense to put in a green deck that has other creatures, and it plays particularly well with mana dorks. Of course, Land of War Elves can allow you to cast it on turn 2, but then you make use of those dorks later, both by using them to tap to give Tyar indestructible, or to pay the mana for that overrun ability, or to reap the benefits of that overrun ability. And tokens are going to play really well in that regard as well, both as fodder to tap to give Tyar indestructible, and more things to pump when you activate that overrun ability. There's great support in the history of Magic for both elves and warriors, but this card is just strong enough and can play anywhere, particularly because the tap ability and that pump ability don't call out creature types. This just pumps all your creatures. They can just tap any of your creatures. You don't need to put Tyar in an elf deck or a warrior deck. It is just an efficient and strong green creature. At number 7, we have Screaming Nemesis. Screaming Nemesis is a 3 mana 3/3 for 2 and a red, a spirit with haste, and whenever Screaming Nemesis is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any other target. If a player is dealt damage this way, they can't gain life for the rest of the game. 3 mana 3/3s with haste is kind of the bar for red. If you give me that much, I'm already thinking I could just put this in my red aggressive deck in any cube that has support for a red aggressive deck, and then you get some gravy. The damage redirection ability is strong in combat, but it's not guaranteed to be effective. You might not ever leverage that. But again, just 3 mana 3/3 haste, that's just useful. You know, if this gets hit by a removal spell, well, you cast a kind of card that you were intending to cast anyway. And then if it does come up that you turn off life gain, that can be quite appealing. There's been more and more just strong cards that gain life in Magic in recent years. There's food tokens, there's Uros, a lot of scary stuff for a red deck that you would want to turn off. So if you can execute that, that can matter in a lot of matchups. I would avoid this if you have life gain as an explicit theme in your cube. It is really not fun to have something that says, oh, I tricked you into putting Soul Warden into your deck, and now it's just a 1 mana 1/1. So I would avoid doing that, but I do like Screaming Nemesis in environments where there is strong life gain and a strong red deck and tension between the two. Number 6 is Unstoppable Slasher. Unstoppable Slasher is a 3 mana 2/3 zombie assassin for 2 and a black. It has Death Touch. Whenever Unstoppable Slasher deals combat damage to a player, they lose half their life rounded up. And when Unstoppable Slasher dies, if it had no counters on it, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with 2 stun counters. What I like about this card is that it's just good in an aggressive or a controlling deck. Your 3 mana 2/3 with Death Touch blocks pretty well. It trades with large things or just gets in the way of small things. And that ability to make your opponent lose half their life makes it a really strong attacker for an aggressive deck. Horrifying for attacking players. It's more modest for attacking planeswalkers, which I kind of like as an aspect that balances the card. It's not just this attacker that is just brutal all the time. If you can put tokens in the way or put your opponent in a position where you have a planeswalker they want to attack, that can definitely mitigate the impact of an Unstoppable Slasher. What I particularly like about Unstoppable Slasher is that it toes the line between modest and powerful very effectively. If you play a game where your opponent just is not able to check your Slasher, maybe they put a blocker in the way, you have a removal spell, you get that first hit in, it deals them a lot of damage. They lose a ton of life right away, and you definitely got your 3 mana's worth in that kind of game. At the same time, there's a lot of cards more powerful than this. There's a lot of ways to answer it. Exile removal, of course, stops it in its tracks. If you just go bigger than Unstoppable Slasher, which there are many ways to do in Magic, as long as the cube is not just players casting one creature and removal spells at a time, the game can get much bigger than Unstoppable Slasher very quickly. But even still, it's just reasonable to put in your black deck if the game can be expected at all to be about creatures attacking and blocking. So I expect this card to end up in quite a lot of cubes. I have it slotted in my original Tubert currently, and I do like the way it fits into that environment quite a lot. At number 5, we have Enduring Innocence. Enduring Innocence is a 3 mana 2/1 enchantment creature, a Sheep Glimmer for 1 white with lifelink. Whenever one or more other creatures you control with power 2 or less enter, you draw a card, and that ability triggers only once each turn. And then, when Enduring Innocence dies, if it was a creature, you return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. At that point, it's just an enchantment, it's no longer a creature. What I like about this card is that the card Welcoming Vampire was already pretty appealing. It's a 3 mana 2/3 with flying that just has that draw a card once a turn when a small creature enters ability. You can just play that, and it's strong in any kind of white aggressive deck, particularly if you're going wide. Helps you build a buffer playing against sweepers. And then Enduring Innocence has this ability to just stick around as an enchantment, even if you are hit by a sweeper. Your opponent casts Damnation, Wrath of God, what have you. This thing just comes back, and then it threatens to draw more cards as you put more cheap creatures onto the battlefield. The life gain is also a surprisingly good kicker on this ability. It just buys time. Drawing extra cards as you build a battlefield against a control deck is just strong. That's a historically effective recipe against control decks. And this life gain really helps you to buy a little buffer if your opponent's trying to curve out on you. If they're trying to deal you damage, you have this blocker, you can gain some life, maybe trade with something, and then you still maintain the ability to draw extra cards because Enduring Innocence comes back as an enchantment that does just that. If you are into this kind of thing for your white decks, I believe this to be the best version of this kind of effect that we have seen. Move over, Mentor of the Meek. Your time is long past. Number 4 is Norin Swift Survivalist. Norin Swift Survivalist is a 1 red mana, 2/1 legendary human coward. Norin Swift Survivalist can't block, and whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you may exile it. You may play that card from exile this turn. This is what we call in the business a Jackal Pup grade, a 1 mana 2/1 that is just stronger than the card Jackal Pup. The exile ability here actually makes it much easier to make good attacks, especially if your deck is full of cheap creatures. If you attack with Norin and some other creature and your opponent, say, has a 1/1 blocker, you just exile whichever creature they block, cast it again post-combat, you push a little damage, you didn't lose any material. That is really threatening, provided you have a low curve or you just have a deck full of creatures with some kind of enter abilities. You can really do some nasty stuff with Norin. And not being able to block isn't really downside. Blocking, after all, is for chumps. A joke that I liked to say on stream back when I was streaming a lot of Prowess and Modern, when my opponent would play some kind of large blocking creature in a game where I was otherwise ahead, sometimes chat would think, oh, what are you going to do about that? And I would say, well, what are they going to do? Block me to death? Because you have to get busy to actually end the game. Blocking, of course, you would rather be able to do it, but it's not that significant a downside if you are an aggressively minded deck. I think that the upside on the attacking ability is much higher than the downside on the not being able to block ability here, and this is a really strong card for red aggressive decks in medium to higher power formats. Number 3 is Overlord of the Balmer. Overlord of the Balmer is a 5 mana 5/5 for 3 black. It's an enchantment creature, avatar horror. It has impending. So there's a cycle of cards with this impending ability. This Overlord has impending 5. And it's 1 and a black to impend it. If you cast it for that impending cost, it enters with 5 time counters, and it's not a creature until the last one is removed, and then at the beginning of your end step, you remove a time counter from it. Whenever Overlord of the Balmer enters or attacks, you mill 4 cards, then you may return a non-avatar creature card or a planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. So it's a really nice self-mill ability. And particularly if you care about Delirium, as I went over at the top of the show, we have an enchantment creature, so it's great there. Self-mill can turn you on, and the fact that it raises dead for a creature or a planeswalker means that the planeswalkers that you're playing to check those Delirium boxes get even better in your deck as you have more ability to find them. Overlord of the Balmer is relatively cheap to cast for its impending cost, or just as a creature for 2 or 5. I like what I see here in a cube that has any kind of consideration for self-mill, and a 5 mana 5/5 just ain't bad. Give that a raise dead ability on it, and this can hang in quite a lot of cubes. It's useful in a range of decks with black having so many ways to use the graveyard. And again, just as a baseline, this is a pretty strong Gravedigger, so this could just show up anywhere. And another thing that I really like about it is that because it's not a May trigger on attacks, Overlord of the Balmer really threatens to actually mill your entire 40-card deck when you're playing games of Cube. I think that could be fun for a couple reasons. 1, it gives you some pause if you want to make an attack on a relatively even battlefield. And 2, sometimes your cube has stuff that is just way better if you can mill that aggressively. And I'm not just talking about Thassa's Oracle. My brain is more in the space of spider spawning, but that does just speak to the range of different ways you can use this card. And there's a lot to like when it comes to a card that can do so many different things, especially a card that is just reasonable to play in games of Magic. At number 2, we have Overlord of the Hauntwoods. This is the green member of that Overlord impending cycle. Overlord of the Hauntwoods is a 5 mana 6/5 enchantment creature avatar horror for 3 green with impending 4 for 1 green. And whenever Overlord of the Hauntwoods enters or attacks, you create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere that is every basic land type. So this is kind of like a 3 mana Rampant Growth or a 5 mana 6/5 that also boosts your mana. Cedric Phillips and Patrick Sullivan used to refer to the card Goblin Heel Cutter on commentary as 2 good deals. It was good to dash it, it was good to cast it. I feel very similarly about Overlord of the Hauntwoods. You cast it, you impending it, you're just getting a good deal either way. I'll pay 3 for a Rampant Growth, I'll pay 5 for a 6/5. I like that the mana fixing here requires a solid base in green. It can be a little bit disinteresting when you get a lot of mana fixing and you only have to pay 1 green pip. When it starts to feel like color requirements on cards are fake, the games can be a lot less interesting. I do like enabling 5 color a little bit. I don't so much like environments where it feels like you are more incentivized to play more colors than not. So Overlord of the Hauntwoods does a very good job of fixing your mana while not making it totally free to do so. And lastly, the card enables some landfall synergies. Making that land token, that can just do cool things with stuff like Lotus Cobra, Tireless Tracker, a lot of cool stuff you can do with this, and I'm a pretty big fan of this design. Finally, at number 1, we have Sheltered by Ghosts. Sheltered by Ghosts is an aura for 1 and a white. It enchants a creature you control, and when Sheltered by Ghost enters, you exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Sheltered by Ghost leaves the battlefield. It also gives enchanted creature +1/+0, lifelink, and ward 2. I think that putting Oblivion Ring on an aura is brilliant. I think putting ward on an aura is also brilliant. The fact that this is something where there's a big risk the turn you play it, or rather you have to try to find a window to play this aura when the risk is mitigated, when your opponent is tapped out, and then it's harder for your opponent to interact with it once it's actually on the battlefield, which helps to push back against the fact that oftentimes when you play an aura, you just get 2 for 1 when your opponent kills your creature. And then that Oblivion Ring effect, just giving this the ability to just push you ahead, to interact with your opponent, but in a way where they can come back. I don't know, there's just a lot happening in the gameplay here that I think is really fun and appealing. And lifelink with +1/+0 is also a nice combination of boons. This card is strong enough to fit in a wide range of cubes. As an uncommon, you can put it in a peasant environment, and any environment that's really about creatures, or at least has a white deck that really cares about creatures. This could be your peasant cube, this could be your vintage cube. I can see hooking this up on a Thraben Inspector in a wide range of environments and being very happy to do so. It is strong, but it is manageable, and that's kind of the perfect shape of a cube card for me, and I am a huge fan of Sheltered by Ghosts. To recap my top 10, at number 10 we have Roaring Furnace / Steaming Sauna. At number 9, Flood Pit's Drowner. Number 8, Tyar The Pummeler. Number 7, Screaming Nemesis. Number 6, Unstoppable Slasher. Number 5, Enduring Innocence. Number 4, Norin, Swift Survivalist. Number 3, Overlord of the Balmer. Number 2, Overlord of the Hauntwoods. And number 1, Sheltered by Ghosts. I see Duskmourn House of Horror as a very significant card for cubes of many shapes and sizes, both for having a graveyard and an enchantment theme. This adds a lot for synergistic environments that care about either or both of these things. I think that the future of the Verge lands is promising, even if they're not necessarily a hit for me today. And there's also a good volume of individually impactful cards in the set, so whether you're interested in synergy, power, both, there's something here for you, which means there's a lot of cards for a lot of cubes, and I have been a fan of playing with many cards from Duskmourn already. Thank you everyone for watching. My perhaps overly ambitious goal is to get a cube year in review video out for next week, where I go over these videos and the articles that I had written for these most cubable cards and go through every release for the entire year 2024, talk about what this year has meant for Cube, talk about my predictions versus the reality as I have played with these sets, and just kind of go over all that, as well as setting expectations and the tone for 2025. So I hope to get that out. Appreciate y'all watching this today, and I'll see you next time.